Welcome to the Darkstream, Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and unauthorized.tv. Tonight, we're going to do something a little different, and we're going to talk about Machiavelli and the disintegration of empire. This is, as you can see, a medieval map of Florence, where Machiavelli was an official and where he spent quite a bit of his life, and of which he was a historian. So we're not streaming tonight. This is just going to be a straight up monologue. As we discussed, I think that it's going to allow us to focus a little bit more on the topic at hand. And a lot of people have a very false idea about Niccolo Machiavelli. The term Machiavellian means somebody who's crafty, amoral, always puts the ends before the means, always justifies the means with the ends, ruthless. There's a reason why people like John Gotti referred to his book The Prince as the Mafia Bible. And this is something that has really misled a lot of people about Machiavelli. He was a rather unprepossessing sort, not from a particularly distinguished family, but he was pretty able. And of course, this is the book that he's most famous for, The Prince. And the reason that I think people misunderstand Machiavelli so completely is because in many cases, The Prince is the only work of Machiavelli that they know. Even if they haven't read it, they've at least heard of it. But what they don't understand is that Machiavelli wrote The Prince for a specific purpose. Now, supposedly, it was inspired by the model of Caesar Borgia, the Pope's illegitimate son, who was made a cardinal, then was the first person in Catholic history to renounce his cardinalate, however you pronounce it, and he became a duke and was one of the more significant forces in Italy until his father died, at which point his power declined very quickly. But even if Machiavelli's book was inspired by Caesar Borgia's successes and failures, the reason he wrote it was actually in order to ingratiate himself with the Medici family, which was not entirely successful because he was initially fired from the chancery and was even put to the torture at one point because they had suspected his loyalties. But if you read Machiavelli's other works, specifically the History of Florence and his discourses on Livy, it becomes very clear that what Machiavelli was describing in The Prince was not expressive of his personal beliefs. What he was doing was applying his mind to the political problems that people in the position of Lorenzo de' Medici or Caesar Borgia or other princes, which didn't have to be princes per se, kings, dukes, leaders of the city, the challenges that they were facing. And so what he was addressing there was a very specific problem and providing what he believed would be the answers to that problem if you were in that position. Machiavelli was not a person who would have trouble distinguishing macro and micro. The prince is a micro solution. But when he talks about government in general, when he talks about philosophy, when he talks about history, it becomes very clear that Machiavelli, the intellectual, is very, very different than Machiavelli, the problem solver for autocrats. And the reason that I'm talking about him here is not because I think that we have to concern ourselves with the correct way to rule over a city-state as a all-powerful authoritarian noble, but because in his history, he discusses a problem that is very, very similar to the problem that we're facing today. And that is the end of the US empire. And the reason that some of these passages from the history of Florence struck me so strongly when I was reading it the last couple of weeks was that it appears to answer a lot of the questions that people have had about the United States when they say, what comes next? They see all these riots, they see all these fires, this arson, this lawlessness, this increased segregation on the part of not just races, but political ideologies, and the way that now the liberal states seem to want to secede from the Union. The increased decentralization and the fact that it's becoming increasingly obvious that what I predicted well over a decade ago, that the United States is going to break apart, whereas that sounded crazy and ridiculous to everyone 10, 15 years ago. Now, there's people who say that my estimated date of 2033 for that might be farther off than events would tend to indicate. I don't believe so, but I have heard that from people. But let me read you two passages from the history of Florence and of the affairs of Italy. The people who inhabit the northern parts beyond the Rhine and the Danube, living in a healthy and prolific region, frequently increase to such multitudes that part of them are compelled to abandon their native soil and seek a habitation in other countries. The method adopted when one of these provinces had to be relieved of its superabundant population was to divide into three parts, each containing an equal number of nobles and of people, of rich and of poor. The third upon who the lot fell then went in search of new abodes, leaving the remaining 2/3 in possession of their native country. These migrating masses destroyed the Roman Empire by the facilities for settlement which the country offered when the emperors abandoned Rome. Now, we've talked about this before, the whole sink the ships thing, the fact that, the later Roman emperors were not even Roman, and the way that mass immigration always tends to lead to conflict, war, and political dissolution. But there's other interesting effects that you might not have considered. And here's one. Here's the other thing that really struck me as related to this. He writes, if we only consider the evils which arise to a republic or a kingdom by a change of prince or of government, not by foreign interference, but by civil discord, in which we may see how even slight variations suffice to ruin the most powerful kingdoms or states, we may then easily imagine how much Italy and the other Roman provinces suffered when they not only changed their forms of government and their princes, but also their laws, customs, modes of living, religion, language, and name. Any one of such changes by itself, without being united with others, might, with thinking of it, to say nothing of the seeing and suffering, infuse terror into the strongest minds. So what he's talking about there is something that I've addressed many times. The movement of people is always followed by change, and it is always followed by war. You see these memes going around comparing the America of 2020 to the America of 2050. Well, they are two different countries. The geography is the same, but the dirt is not magic. The people have changed. what passes for American today is not, on average, what Americans were 70 years ago. The people have changed. America is no longer America. What it is, we don't know. We can't say. It has the same name, but it doesn't mean the same thing. If you simply look at the average IQ, I estimate that the average IQ of the United States resident is probably 8 to 10 points lower, not percentage, but IQ points lower than it was in 1950. And, we've seen social scientists writing entire books about how possibly the most significant aspect of what determines what a society is like is its average IQ. So Machiavelli was telling us back in the 15th century that what was permitted in 1965 was going to result in the changes of laws, changes of customs, changes of modes of living, changes of religion, language, and name, enough to infuse terror into the strongest minds. Now, part of the problem is only the strongest minds appear to be capable of understanding this or recognizing it. People are now recognizing the consequences, but they should have recognized the causes back when they were first beginning to happen. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. From these causes proceeded the ruin, as well as the origin and extension of many cities. Among those which were ruined were Aquileia, Luni, Chiusi, Popolonia, Fiesole, and many others. The new cities were Venice, Siena, Ferrara, Aquila, with many towns and castles, which for brevity we omit. Those which became extended were Florence, Genoa, Pisa, Milan, Naples, and Bologna, to which all may be added the ruin and restoration of Rome and many cities not previously mentioned. And so he talks about how all these changes took place. And cities that used to be major population centers no longer were destroyed, in some cases utterly. Other cities, brand new cities, like Venice, which became a world power, actually took shape during that time. Italian people, natives, retreated when the Lombards arrived in what's now known as Lombardia. They retreated into the swamps and islands off the coast because the inland people, the barbarians, didn't have ships. So they were able to retreat there and set up a city unmolested, and from there it grew into a major power over time, a world power over time. But I've got some pictures here, and I think it's interesting to have a look at what these cities are. So he mentioned Fiesole, and this is what it looks like now. Not too bad, huh? In fact, it's not only not too bad, it is now the wealthiest suburb of Florence, which is kind of fascinating because it was actually mentioned in Dante's Inferno. It says, "Ma quello ingrato popolo maligno che dicese di Fiesole ab antico e tieni ancor del monte e del macigno." What he's saying there is that, but these evil people that descend from ancient Fiesole, they come down from the mountains, and then it refers later to le bestie fiesolane, which means that there's nothing there but animals. And so what he's referring to is the destruction of a town which was big during, as you can see here, the Roman era. So this is a Roman theater today. In fact, if you notice, it is the same tower. You can see the same tower off in the distance here in the middle. So right behind that tower on the other side is this old Roman amphitheater. That tells you how long that city has been there. But in between the 10th century and the probably 17th century, there was nothing there. When Dante was writing in the 15th century, when Machiavelli was writing in the 15th century, the town was gone. It was destroyed. It says, in fact, it says, Fiesole was the scene of Stilicho's great victory over the Germanic hordes of the Vandals and Suebi in 406. During the Gothic War in 536, the town was besieged several times, and in 539, Justin, the Byzantine general, captured it and razed its fortifications. And then there's it was sacked again in 1010. And then it was conquered by Florence in 1125, and its leading families were forced to take up residence in Florence. So basically, after 1125, it was pretty much destroyed. And then 300 years later, some rich Florentines began to build there, and they actually were referred to. One of the villas that is in Fiesole is referred to in the setting of the Decameron by Boccaccio. And so it's really fascinating to see how this town went from being a fairly important town to getting completely wiped out, and now it's a wealthy suburb of Florence. But the things didn't go so well for everywhere. Remember that they referred to Popolonia. Well, this is what Popolonia looks like now. As you can see, there is very little there. This is a picture of it from a distance, and it doesn't look too bad. You know, seems very small, but when you get closer, you can see that most of the city is completely gone. And in fact, there's only 17 people that live there today. So these are the kind of changes that took place as a result of the mass immigration and subsequent wars and conflict in Italy. Now let's look at what the result of that was. This is what Italy looked like in Machiavelli's time. So these are all the major kingdoms, principalities, and so forth. You've got the Kingdom of Naples in the south. The Kingdom of Sicily actually belonged to the Spanish Kingdom of Aragon, as did the island of Sardinia. You had the Republic of Genoa, Republic of Florence, Republic of Siena. And then you had the two big powers at this time were the Duchy of Milan and the Republic of Venice. Those two, along with the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples, were essentially struggling for power all throughout Machiavelli's life, as well as for about a century prior, and which eventually led to what Machiavelli considered to be the great tragedy, which was the eventual invasion by the Kingdom of France. And so you can see how what had been one empire is completely shattered into about 20-25 pieces. So the reason that this is significant, the reason I'm pointing this out, is because when you talk to people about the U.S. breaking apart, they tend to think of it in terms of, you know, like the U.S. and the Confederacy, or they tend to think in geographic terms, or they tend to think in terms of, well, maybe there'll be a country here and a country there. They tend to, you never hear anyone talking about more than 5 to 7 political entities. But look at the size of Italy, and look at how many different states there are with very different political systems. You know, the Republic of Florence was governed in a very, very different way than either the Kingdom of Naples or the the Papal States. And so we need to think in terms of much smaller entities, much more local entities. For example, and this is why, because when you look at, those were the actual entities that ended up becoming states after a long period of war and conflict and struggle. But if you look at this map from the game at Machiavelli, what you see is that they've actually divided it up into what were the effective territories. So, for example, the Bergamo, which is right here, was traditionally ruled over by Venice, but it was also often ruled over by Milan. So it was actually a separate principality at one point. Because of its strategic position between those two powers, it tended to change hands pretty often. And so when you're thinking of the polities that will survive the eventual dissolution of the U.S. empire, you actually should be thinking more in terms of hundreds of towns, of city-states, rather than these larger institutions. Because when the decentralization happens, all of these policing functions, all of these centralized government functions are going to fail. And they're not just going to fail in Washington, D.C. They're going to fail in St. Paul. They're going to fail in Sacramento. We're already seeing that the governor of Portland, the governor of Oregon, can't do anything about what is happening in their own central major city, much less what's happening up in the woods, in the forest. And so everything is going to be, most likely, if history repeats itself, as it usually does, everything is much more likely to be on a much smaller scale, a much more local scale. And that's where we get to what we're beginning to see people talk about with regards to homesteading and things like Owen's Bertaria and so forth. I'm gonna end it tonight. We're gonna pick up with this at the next one, but have a look at this map of a town called Imola by a rather well-known artist. If you recognize the style, you'll know that's Da Vinci. But this is his map of Imola. And what I found really interesting is I looked up the size of the average medieval town, medieval walled city. And it turns out that they tend to average around 250 to 400 acres. And, that's the size of a pretty good homestead when you think about it. So anyhow, it may sound like a bit of a stretch, but I think that we have a lot to learn from history. And I think from being both a student of the end of the Roman Empire, as well as a witness to some of the major conflicts of the wars between the city-states that subsequently followed that dissolution, I think that Niccolo Machiavelli, especially in his History of Florence, may give us some idea of what we can reasonably expect to happen over the next 20 to 50 years in the United States. I'm Voxday. This is the Darkstream.